In 1961, the then Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev visited China as a part of a series of state visits. During that visit, Khrushchev publicly criticized the policies of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party, particularly the Great Leap Forward. That was a massive industrialization campaign that resulted in economic and humanitarian catastrophe. Khrushchev's criticism was seen as a direct challenge to Mao's leadership of China. In response, Mao delivered a scathing rebuke to Khrushchev. It later came to be known as the Two Whatevers speech. Mao declared that the Chinese people would follow their own path of communism no matter whatever the Russians say and whatever the Russians do. Hence, the Two Whatevers. This incident marked a turning point in what was called the Sino-Soviet split. 10 years after that, Richard Nixon, the US president at that time, visited Beijing in what would have been unthinkable during the Cold War. But today, and recent history, is a different story. For now, more than 3 decades, Moscow and Beijing have been strengthening their partnership, and none more so than since the start of this Russia-Ukraine war. Russia is increasingly been seen as a junior partner to China. Russia is being co-opted by China in its great power competition with America. The US is a common enemy for both Beijing and Moscow. But if Russian President Vladimir Putin was no longer in a leadership role, would this relationship unravel? On Curx Decode, will a change of leadership in the Kremlin complicate Russia-China cooperation? What sort of ideological shifts would we see? Would the power elites who have been backing Putin so far also dump China if there were to be a regime change in Moscow? The prospects for Russia's democratization or improvement in relations with the West have been the worst in the last 2 decades currently. It is Russia's domestic politics that is most likely to play a significant role in affecting any future course of the relationship between Beijing and Moscow. Any change in the Kremlin is likely to upset a delicate balance in Russia's political as well as economic ecosystem. It would also lead to a new round of power struggles for both influence and resources. Moscow has signed a number of agreements with China, which, more than being important for Russia, are they important for Russia's ruling elite, this elite which collectively prop up Putin in power. In return for these deals, these ruling elite created a powerful pro-China lobby in the corridors of the Kremlin. Without Putin's patronage, these business empires could be targeted by a new leader. There will also be pressure from Western countries to decouple from China. If China also decided to employ wolf warrior diplomacy, where its diplomats aggressively target countries who are either not in China's ambit or are unwilling to do business with it, then that could also potentially alienate the Russian elite who were previously allies of China. Some Russian scholars have also warned of this even before the war in Ukraine began. An escalation of China's cyber, industrial, and traditional espionage practices was seen, and Russian intelligence agencies have not been able to push back against this, particularly against deep-seated surveillance capabilities that the Chinese would display. A new leader, of course, would have an opportunity to reassess the degree of Russia's dependence on China. It's also worth remembering that already back in the mid-2000s, Russia was trying to make a turn to the east. It was not a turn to China. Russia's policy towards Asia was to be more balanced, more diversified, focus on cooperation with China, Japan, Korea, as well as other Southeast Asian countries. In fact, oil and gas pipelines were meant to serve Asian customers, not just Chinese ones. Meanwhile, China has been buying the lion's share of Russia's oil after the start of this war, even though there is an official embargo in half the world. The power of Siberia gas pipelines and its potential second branch go to China and only to China. That would make it impossible for Russia to start exporting gas to other customers. The participation of Russian aircraft and Russian ships in joint patrols with China around Japan is far more beneficial to Beijing than it is to Moscow. In fact, it limits Moscow's room for maneuver to forge other allies in Asia. Since the war began, Japan and South Korea, which had been non-committal so far and have only been further pushed into the American embrace because of this emerging Russia-China axis. The Russian elite do not see China as a threat to their security or their survival. Therefore, it is easier for Moscow to interpret China's rise as a superpower as something that is friendly and something that they're even willing to accept as a growing global role for Beijing, even if that makes Russia a less significant partner or a junior partner. The financial and political benefits gained from this partnership by individual members of the Russian elite have also been another big driver for this relationship. And no one is more enthusiastic about this axis between China and Russia more than Igor Sechin, who's the head of the state-owned oil firm Rosneft. China, of course, is the most important partner for Rosneft. Also, nuclear energy corporations like Rosatom are still benefiting from having a presence in the Chinese market. Now, without a doubt, a new Russian leader's hands would be tied because of these ruling Russian elites and their fingers in the pie, as it were, in China. Oil and gas pipelines leading up to China connect Russian companies with this huge market, and that is not easily replaceable. The selective support offered by China at the United Nations Security Council as well as General Assembly has consolidated the pro-Beijing nature of the Russian elite. Even before this war began in Ukraine, Beijing helped some Russian companies circumvent sanctions from the Western countries by offering prepayments for oil on providing huge loans. A large part of the Russian elite sees China as the only partner they have against the West. Nevertheless, any new leader, if it came down to that, will have an opportunity to re-evaluate the costs and benefits of close ties with Beijing. And it will be in the interests of Russia and in the interests of this new leader to do so, if only to strengthen his or her hand.